Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. I'm really excited today that we're going to have one of our own, Kerianne Lawson, here, who's going to present on the role that economic freedom plays in enhancing opportunities for women. Really excited about that. I'm excited to see so many people here today. So if you enjoyed today's presentation, also please come on April 5th. We're going to have Antonio Saravia, who's going to present on economic freedom and Latin America. So that will also be an interesting presentation. So Kerianne Lawson is a scholar at the Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth and an assistant professor of economics in the Department of Agribusiness and Applied Economics at North Dakota State University. She teaches courses on real estate, microeconomics, and math economics. Her research interests include economic freedom, crime, and civil unrest, and electricity reliability. Her work on the expansion of property rights in South Africa sheds light on the charitable work done by the Khaya Lam Project and its role in deterring crime, encouraging investment, and creating opportunities for entrepreneurship. Dr. Lawson also conducts research on the importance of economic freedom at the local, state, and national level and how it relates to political freedom and economic growth. And again, I'm really excited that Carrie's here today to display some of her great work, and I know we're going to learn a lot. And so without any further delay, let's please welcome Dr. Kerianne Lawson.
Thanks, John. Okay, good morning, everybody. So I'm Carrie, and today we're going to be talking about women and economic freedom. So I'm just going to do a quick outline of what we're going to cover today. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is not my own research, but research that has inspired work that I currently do. And so first we're going to talk about what economic freedom is, and then we're going to talk about, the benefits of economic freedom, why it's good, or why I'm going to argue that it's good. And then we're going to talk about these kind of gaps in economic freedom between men and women. And that's going to be the main crux of the talk, is talking about how a lot of places around the world, economic freedom isn't the same between men and women. And so then we'll talk about what happens when we increase economic freedom just overall for everyone, but then in particular for women, and like the good things we can expect to happen. Spoiler alert. It's good news if we have economic freedom, and it's good news if we increase it, and it's great news if we increase it for both men and women, right? And we'll talk about why we should even care, right? And I think that by the end you'll see why we should care. And so first, what is economic freedom? And so, on a personal note, my father is one of the original co-authors, founders of the Economic Freedom of the World Index. So this is something that I've known about my entire life. So this is very near and dear to my heart. I knew about economic freedom well before I ever knew I wanted to be an economist. And I think that it's something that everyone should know about, whether or not you're going to be continuing on studying economics or thinking about economics in your day-to-day. But what is economic freedom? It's just your ability to do business without intervention from the government, right? That's kind of the baseline. But really what it means is your ability to choose how you want to work, right? And your personal choice and how you want to spend your time. It also means that you're able to freely participate in markets, and there's no coercion involved. And if you're in my 201 class, you know that it's very important to have free trade, right? Gains from trade happen when we have voluntary exchange, mutually beneficial exchanges. We also know that people are able to enter, there are very low barriers to entry, and that it's competitive in these markets. And we also know that there's private property is protected under the law, and that it's enforced and well defined. And so again, if you're in my Econ 201 class, and it's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the room, you guys know that I just talk about property rights all the time, right? It's not just in class, but it's also in my research as well. So the Economic Freedom of the World Index is for 160 countries, and they go all the way back to 1950 up to present. And there are 5 areas of the Economic Freedom Score that they kind of evaluate countries, right? So we'll talk about these 5 areas. First is the size of government. Kind of makes sense. If you have a bigger government, it might be more difficult to do certain things within your business. This is stuff like taxes and spending, and all these kinds of things go into the size of government. We also have the legal system and property rights area, area 2, which I'll focus a lot on today. That's my favorite area of the index. And that's just, how are property rights defined, enforced, contracts, how fair are your courts, things like this. We also have sound money, so this is going to be kind of your monetary policy side of things. Inflation is like a tax on saving, so if you keep inflation low, that's good for economic freedom. And then we also have the ability to trade internationally, so this is something for our international index, right? So the EFW, which I'll talk about mostly in this talk, is looking at the country level how economically free the people are, but they actually have indices for state level and city level as well, which I think is pretty interesting. You can look at that on your own time. And then we also have the regulatory burden in Area 5. So this is stuff like how easy is it for you to start a business? So there's a really great, the Doing Business report had some really great information about, how long does it take for you to open up like a simple warehouse in your country? And so in some places, it takes like a month, maybe several months in order to get all the permits and fill out all the forms and pay all the fees, et cetera, et cetera. But in some countries, like I think Hong Kong is the example, they usually get the lowest score or the best score here. I think they round it up to 1 day. Like you can start a simple warehouse facility in less than a day in Hong Kong. Like that's very easy to do business. The regulatory burden is crazy low in places like that. In the US, it's like several weeks, maybe a couple months, depending on where you are, right? So varying degrees of how easy is it for you to do business and, kind of the environment that you're operating in. So how do you get a high economic freedom score? We kind of talked about it when we went through the areas, but you kind of got to keep taxes low. You got to have like very few regulations. You want to make sure it's easy for people to trade. It's easy for people to open businesses. And, it's on a scale of 1 to 10. So it's based off of 50 variables and in those 5 categories, and you get a score for each of the 5 areas. You kind of add them, average them up, and that's your kind of score. So it's pretty rudimentary, you know what I mean? It's just arithmetic, right? They're just adding numbers up. But the good news is all the data is publicly available, so people can tinker with it however they please. But basically the essence of it is the higher the economic freedom score, the more economically free you are. And you could think of it on a scale of 1 to Adam Smith, right? Like 10 being the dream world of Adam Smith. And no country has a 10, but some countries score very high. And so I think my next slide should be my map. Oh, I'll go back. This area 2, I'm bolding it, but the slide's kind of hard to say. This area 2 being that its property rights are equally enforced amongst all people. So it's not just for men or just for a particular group in that country, it's for all of the people. And that's something that the Economic Freedom Index has really started to emphasize in recent years, which is kind of the point of this talk. And so people like maps, so I'm gonna put a map up here. This is kind of the Economic Freedom of the World reports, kind of summary of how everybody ranks or scores. The blue countries are your first quartile, so those are your top most economically free countries. Green is the second quartile, yellow, and then red. As you can see, there are some regional things going on here. Of course, always we're gonna have a fourth of the countries are gonna be red on these maps, right? So even though you might be in the lower half or quartile of economically free countries, that doesn't mean that you haven't improved your economic freedom, and I'll talk about that as well. But I think it's kind of interesting. Number 1 right now is Singapore. It's been Hong Kong for a long time, but now it's Singapore. And I think last is Venezuela, Zimbabwe. They kind of take turns. I don't remember what this year is. So economic freedom is associated with good things. And so a lot of people have written a bunch of papers, hundreds of papers. This paper that is kind of doing a survey of the literature is from 2014. They just recently updated it in 2022. Now there are 700 plus papers that they look at. It's a lot of research is being done just looking at whether or not economic freedom is associated with good or bad things. And I mean it in the normative sense for my students in Econ 201. I mean normatively good, right? So things that we might agree are good things like living longer, being happier, having more money, all these kinds of things, having jobs. The economic freedom is associated with increases in income, employment, entrepreneurship, happiness, pretty much all the things that we kind of can agree in this room if we polled this room. Good stuff, right? And so they see that 2/3 of the papers find that economic freedom is significantly, statistically significantly associated with good things. And very few papers, like 4% of the papers, are associated with bad things. That's also great for those of us who are fans of economic freedom. And the rest is kind of mixed for a variety of reasons. It could be that they are only looking at certain areas of the index instead of the whole thing, so on and so forth. It remains the same when they update the paper. Over half of the papers are associated with good things, and a very small percent, like 5%, is associated with bad things. And the bad things that we typically see economic freedom is associated with is obesity, pollution, and there's some evidence of income inequality. So those are kind of the three that keep cropping up. And so there's been some work on trying to understand, how and in what ways, right, economic freedom is associated with those bad things. But like I said, economic freedom scores, we always are going to have those red countries, that bottom quartile countries, but the good news is economic freedom scores have been increasing over the last 2 decades. This is the, international average, usually around like a 6.5 out of 10, up to almost a 7 out of 10. That drop you see in the last 2 years is because of COVID regulations that restricted trade and increased regulations. It's not any statement on whether or not it was a good idea to do COVID regulations. It's just, it made it more difficult to do business. So some countries got dinged on that. We fully expect those scores to increase in the coming years. So we'll just have a little bit of a blip there. Pretty much every map, I think, or graph that economists show now will have a little blip in that 2020 range. So, economic freedom is no different. So economic freedom is increasing and it's good, but we had some issues kind of up until this point where we weren't really thinking about the equality of economic freedom. So Rosemarie Fike, who's now a professor at Texas Christian, when she was a graduate student at Florida State, she went to her advisor, Jim Gortney, who is one of the other founding co-authors of the index, and said, there are all these countries that score really high on the economic freedom index, but we know that women don't have the same economic freedom as men. Like, it's very easy for a man to do business in these countries, but not for a woman. And she's like, you should do something about it. And he was like, well, why don't you do something about it? So she put together this index, the Gender Disparity Index. And now it's included in the EFW, and they've updated all the past scores as well. So basically, this is going to affect that Area 2 score of the Economic Freedom Index. How equal are men and women in terms of their legal standing in the country? And so, she formulated this in 2015, and then it got incorporated in 2017. And basically, you get a score of 0 to 1. So 0 being that there is no equality between men and women, and then 1 being that men and women are equal in terms of these criteria that I'll talk about next, right? And so some countries like the US, on the books, legally, women and men have equal economic freedom. I can open up a bank account just the same way as any man, right? I can start a business the same way as any man. I can get a passport the same way as any man, right? Those kinds of things are quite easy for us to imagine here in the US, but that is not the case in many parts of the world. So these are the 17 questions that Rosie includes from the Women, Business, and the Law survey that the World Bank puts out, basically focusing on just the stuff that has to do with economic freedom for women. So, some of the ones that I think are interesting are being able to work at night or work in dangerous jobs. That's a really common thing that's still regulated in a lot of parts of the world, that women are deemed fragile and are unable to work outside of the home at night. But there are still some countries where you still have to have permission from your husband to even get a job or to travel outside your home. And so there's a lot of restrictions placed on women that aren't placed on men that certainly affect their economic freedom. And so this GDI score kind of gives us an opportunity to understand how equal the economic freedom is. Over time, though, GDI scores have increased. Good news, right? Just like economic freedom scores. I mean, the average now in the world is about 0.8 or 0.9. And, I'll talk about this at the end, but for the most part, they've been scores have been increasing, but we have recently seen some countries decrease their gender disparity index scores, which should be alarming to any of us who are fans of economic freedom or fans of economic freedom for women, which hopefully everyone in the room is, that, you know, there are some restrictions that are being placed on economic freedom for women in particular that will have very detrimental effects. So again, people like maps. So I'm gonna show you a couple just questions from the GDI to show how they've changed from 1970 to present. So the first graph, or the first map here is 1970, and the question is, can women take jobs the same as men, right? So the questions always are, can a woman do this in the same way as a man? So if both can do it, then it's good, and if both can't do it, then it's the same too, you know what I mean? So in this case, can women take a job in the same way as a man? No being those reddish color, blue being yes, and then you see it change to 2021. You know, a vast majority of those countries over this period made it so that women can have jobs the same way as men, right? So we're seeing these increases in economic freedom for women over this time period. Same deal here with whether or not women can open a bank account the same way as a man. A lot of countries, and again, this isn't like, it is regional, but it is, you're seeing it in like Europe, Africa, South America, Asia, you know, it's all over, being able to not open a bank account in the same way as a man in 1970, which isn't that ancient history, you know, to today. So this whole equal economic freedom thing, we know that economic freedom scores are increasing, and we know that gender disparity scores are increasing, so that should be, you know, good news, but we also know that there are still these gaps that persist, particularly in the Middle East. A lot of these countries, when they incorporated the gender disparity score into the Area 2, you know, category of their economic freedom score, their rankings fell significantly, almost like 30 places in some of them. It's a lot. And, you know, when we're talking about 160 countries, if you drop 30 places, it's a big fall. But that's because half of your population is economically free and the other half isn't. And so there should be some sort of adjustment for that. And that's what, I mean, I fully agree with that. You know, and it's hard for us to imagine, like I said, in the US, that men and women don't have the same levels of economic freedom, but we actually have a history of this as well. And it's not too ancient of history either. I'll start with the old stuff first, but this is some research that I have with my master's student, Kaylee, who's in the room. Hey, Kaylee. I won't embarrass her, but she's in the back there. And so we're gonna kind of talk through the legal history of economic freedom for women in the US, because surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, no one's actually formally articulated this in the literature, and that's something that we think is a kind of a big gap, right? We have Claudia Golden's wonderful work about women's history in the US, and I think if anybody was at the Nobel Prize event that I did, you know, you'll know that I'm a huge fan of her work. But we haven't really talked about it from an economic freedom perspective, and especially just thinking through what these expansions in economic freedom for women in the United States did to things like education, labor force participation, incomes, et cetera. So that's what we're going to be doing for her master's thesis, and I just kind of wanted to give a little shout out to Kaylee there. And some of the interesting laws. So I don't have, I'll have it on the next slide too, I don't have on the slides the Equal Pay Act or the Civil Rights Act or the 19th Amendment, which are very important things, but these are some of these like lesser known laws that maybe people in the audience wouldn't know about. But being able to like own your own property in your own name, being able to file patents, to be able to enter contracts on your own, to be able to collect rents, get an inheritance, all these kinds of things were laws that had to be passed. They weren't just taken as given initially. And throughout US history, we kind of expanded economic freedom for women. And then also, you know, there have been some setbacks. So in 1908, Oregon limited the number of work, like hours a woman could work to 10. And of course, a 10-hour workday is quite a long day, of course, but you know, but the kind of implication there is that women are too fragile, right? That they couldn't work for 10 hours, or that they have something else that they should be doing, like household duties or taking care of children, right? And I think that that's an infringement on economic freedom, right? That being able to decide how many hours I want to work is entirely my business, right? And so I think that that was a kind of a setback. But we've also seen some increases in, in the 70s, being able to open up bank accounts or lines of credit without, a man to co-sign is a relatively new thing, and then also not being fired for getting pregnant, right? So these are, again, to me, it's like bonkers, right? But it's not that long ago. So I think that this is something that we need to talk about more in the literature. It's not just that men and women are equal and that's it. Like, there's a lot of room for improvement, and this is stuff that's happening in the U.S. Plenty of really developed countries that you might think of, as being like progressive, have laws that are further behind than us in terms of women's economic freedom. It's a real shame. So some questions that I often get when I talk about this research is, what about norms? Like, we can change laws, but there are still going to be kind of attitudes towards how women should spend their days, right? Or how much women should work, or in what ways women should work. And so Rosie Fike, who is the founder of the GDI Index, has been basically, for the most part, alone doing research in this area for the last 7 years, right? I mean, a few people have been working with her, but she's been kind of on her own, just kind of shouting into the void, being like, hey, we should be talking about economic freedom for women. And it isn't only until recently people have actually kind of started doing research along with her, thanks to some wonderful donor support and grant work that's been trying to push the research further in this area. So one of the things that Rosie's been looking at lately is gender norms. So there are a lot of really great surveys that look at, people's attitudes towards gender, and she's finding that, increases in economic freedom and increases in gender disparity actually are shaping norms. Like, we increase economic freedom for women, and she's finding that people are more likely to agree or disagree with these statements that, men have more right to a job than women, or men make better leaders than women, and all these kinds of things. I'm like, well, that's good, because sometimes people say you just change the laws and nothing actually changes. Well, it seems like if we change the laws and allow women to participate in the economy easier, maybe people's attitudes will follow. And that's also kind of encouraging finding, I think. So, kind of building on this, we got to talk about what happens when we increase economic freedom. We know economic freedom is associated with a bunch of good things, but does economic freedom cause good things? That's the question, right? That's kind of been the missing link in this literature. And so it isn't until recently people are trying to use fancy econometric techniques that I will not bore you with today to figure out whether or not economic freedom actually causes good stuff. It's not just that they're kind of just going together, right? So we look at these increases in economic freedom, these big jumps in your economic freedom score of maybe 1 point or greater. It's about a standard deviation for my stats nerds in the room. And so 1 point jump in the economic freedom score, that's big, that's substantial, and they're going to call that an economic liberalization in the literature. Basically, a big reform has happened. And so it could be that you changed your score dramatically in one area, many areas. We can talk, we'll get through all of that too. That's kind of something that we're unpacking now. It's kind of fun to talk about this because all these papers are being currently written. So I'm not talking about old stuff, I'm talking about new stuff. But the Greer and Greer paper was the first one to really say, well, if we have these big jumps in economic freedom, we can match those countries to countries that didn't have increases in economic freedom and look at incomes. And they find that after these big reforms, these big liberalizations, incomes increase. Hooray! So they're going to argue that economic freedom isn't just associated with higher incomes, it actually causes higher incomes. So if we expand economic freedom, people will get richer. That's what they argue. I'm like, whoa, that's like a big claim, but Kevin and Robin can make those kinds of claims because they're fancy and really good at what they do, right? And then we had Challey and Young follow up, and they actually find that it's not just increasing income for the top group, it's actually increasing income for all groups. So it's a rising tide lifts all boats kind of argument, right? So it's not just an income inequality expansion, it's actually it's increasing income for all sides of the distribution of incomes. Pretty neat. And then, I have a follow-up paper with Justin that just got accepted woo, about what happens when these reforms don't work. So there's a handful of countries where they increase their economic freedom scores, but we don't see changes in income. And we were like, that's annoying. Why? Let's try to see if there's any commonalities between them. And there are a few, but one of the ones that we really talk about is that they don't reform in Area 2. So these countries that have these big jumps in economic freedom, if they do it in say, the sound money area rather than the area about legal systems and property rights, which happens to have our gender disparity score in it, right? Then they don't see the same gains that the other countries did. And the countries that expanded in Area 2 saw gains in their incomes. We're thinking that that Area 2 of the economic freedom score is pretty important. And I'm going to take it a step further than I even did in the paper and say that it might have something to do with the gender disparity score. And that's something that should be looked at in the follow-up work, but the paper's already accepted, so I guess we'll have to write something else, right? So it's okay. There's ever expanding. That's how this goes, right? So, because people are always curious, these are the countries that reform under that Greer and Greer paper that have a 1-point jump in their economic freedom score, and it's sustained for at least 5 years at any point between 1970 and 2015. The point of this slide is mostly just because people are going to be curious. And also, because I think it's nice to show that it's a lot of different countries. It's not your, necessarily lower developed countries. It's kind of all over the board. There's no regional trends here. It seems to be that economic liberalizations are happening all over the world during this time period. And so what inspired by all of that work that's been done on these increases in economic freedom, and that's just 2 papers. Now, after that first paper got published, now everybody's doing it, right? It's like the new thing in vogue in economic freedom. Everybody's gonna do these jump papers now until they tell us it's a bad idea. But for now, we're doing the jump papers, right? And so inspired by this, I started thinking about, well, we're doing increases in economic freedom, but what about increases in the gender disparity score, just looking at that? So not just increases in economic freedom, but increases in the equality of economic freedom. I think that might matter. So these are the countries that experience large increases in their the equality of their economic freedom, or their gender disparity score. And I bolded and underlined the ones that have overlap to that previous list, just so you're aware. So it's not actually a ton of overlap. Interesting, I think. And these are the countries that have an increase on their GDI score of 0.23 or greater. Again, standard deviation. That's just going to be the rule of thumb for now until they tell us it's a bad idea, right? And so these are the countries that I look at in my research now. So the paper that I'm going to talk about now is the first one I did kind of using this methodology, where I look at large increases in economic freedom, a la Greer and Greer, and then I also add my own Kerianne Lawson twist to it, where I look at large increases in the gender disparity score and say, what happens to these fertility outcomes? So there's a pretty substantial development literature that looks at the relationship between income and fertility. Basically, for the most part, the consensus is that incomes rise, we have fewer kids. That's pretty much the consensus. So then I started to say, well, what about, we know that economic freedom is associated with income, but what about just increasing the opportunity cost of having a kid for a woman, right? If you have more economic opportunities, more economic freedom, it certainly will increase your opportunity cost of having another child, right? Or having a child at all. And so I look at the fertility rates, I look at the sex ratio, which is the male to female birth ratio. It's around 1.05 is the international average, meaning that there's a slight preference for males. So some of you are like, how can you gain that? And so there are 2 kind of ways that we think about this. Is one, that you have a son and then you stop having kids, right? Because you had the son and you're done, right? The other argument is that there are some countries that still have sex selective abortions. So there's some evidence of this as well, right? So this male preference comes through in the sex ratio. And so that's a pretty common thing to look at in the development literature. And then we also have infant mortality rates, kind of getting at just the health of infants and mothers, right? I also did maternal mortality and find similar results. I just didn't talk about them here for some reason. I also look at the average age of mothers at the birth of their first child to kind of talk about this opportunity cost argument that I make in the paper, right? If the opportunity cost of having a kid is increased because you're more economically free, then you probably will wait longer to have children. I control for all the usual suspects that you would see in the development literature. Plus, I also think about other policies related to fertility and family planning, namely whether or not the government has an official policy to raise or lower the fertility rate, the grounds on which abortion is permitted, because some countries have had to ban sex-selective abortions, right? And then you also have whether or not there's any sort of government support for family planning. So those are kind of things that are, again, standard in the literature, but still interesting. So what I find is that when we have these increases in economic freedom, we see no change in fertility rates when we just look at total economic freedom, but we see a decrease in economic freedom when we look at the gender disparity score. So the kind of prior expectation I had going into this turned out to be correct. Nice, right? That we increase economic freedom for women, in particular, increase the equality of economic freedom between men and women, and we see that the opportunity cost of having a child increases, and women have fewer children. They have children later, about 1.5 years later, and the sex ratio also decreases, basically meaning that that male preference also decreases. It's not such a big deal to have a daughter anymore, right? It's not the worst thing in the world. Actually, people are having more daughters. This is kind of what I'm finding there. So I think that that's pretty cool addition to literature. We haven't really talked about fertility outcomes or any women's outcomes in economic freedom literature to date, but thanks to all of those donations and donor support, like I mentioned, there's kind of a slew of papers coming out now that are looking at the role of economic freedom for women in particular. So I'm going to give some shout outs to some friends that also did some great research in this area. So Stone and Piano have a paper that looks at the fertility gap. This is just in the US, but the fertility gap is the difference between the number of children that a woman says that they want and then the number of children that they actually have. And they're going to argue that that's probably a better metric than just fertility rates. And I agree, I would use it if we had it at the international level, right? But the gap between your wanted and your actual basically means, are we matching preferences? Meaning, are you having, you don't want to have more children than you said you wanted to have, but also you don't want to have fewer children than you said you wanted to have. You want to have the number of children that you said you wanted to have, right? So that gap shrinking as we increase economic freedom seems to be a good thing, normatively good thing. We also see that education outcomes improve, particularly for female students in countries that increase their economic freedom and their economic freedom for women. And this comes through in fertility rates and just primary school enrollment, right? So investing in women's education becomes more of a thing once you feel like they have economic opportunities, right? If you have no economic opportunities, why do you need to learn how to read, right? But now it seems like if you have the ability to open a business, the ability to participate in the economy, the sort of incentives start to change about, well, is it, do we send Susie to school, right? Then we also have female entrepreneurship. They find some increases in particularly the opportunity type of entrepreneurship. So the difference between, necessity-based and opportunity-based entrepreneurship. So are you being an entrepreneur because you can and you want to versus you have to, because there are no available jobs. So the necessity-based entrepreneurship we consider to be kind of not the greatest, right? You're doing some sort of entrepreneurial work because there are no available jobs in your area. But opportunity-based entrepreneurship is doing it because you have the opportunity to be an entrepreneur and you have the ability to do so. So seeing that these increases for female opportunity-based entrepreneurship is great news. And then also that, especially when it comes through in the area 2, we see increases in female entrepreneurship. So these are some of the papers that are being worked on, and every time I go now to these conferences, there are more sessions on women and economic freedom than there have ever been, and I think that's awesome because it's something that we just haven't really discussed too much. But the good news is we seem to see that when we expand economic freedom for women, we get benefits for pretty much everybody. And I'm going to argue that even though a lot of those outcomes were female-based, like female entrepreneurship or female literacy or any of those other things, you could say that, well, that's going to be good for everybody, right? It's good for children to be able to go to school. It's good for, entrepreneurs are positive externalities on communities, right? So it's good to have expanding entrepreneurship, whether they're male or female. And it's also, important to have better health outcomes, lower infant mortality and lower maternal mortality, right? So this is kind of thing that would be beneficial to everybody in the society. And seems to be the case that haven't really found that expanding economic freedom for women is associated with any bad things yet, right? I don't think we will, but maybe we will. And so it's kind of an exciting time to be working in this area because, like I said, not very many people are working in it. And now they're starting to, and it seems like there are a lot of pretty obvious policy recommendations that we can make because we actually see which laws are preventing women from participating in the economy and saying, when this country got rid of this law, they saw an increase in their entrepreneurship for women, or they saw a decrease in their infant mortality. Like, this is pretty interesting stuff. And so kind of the next steps, I think that people are starting to look at in the literature, kind of spoilers here for what's to come. I'm noticing that a lot of people are going to be looking at which specific policies. So I had those 17 questions, right, of the GDI. Some of those are going to be more important than others. And so trying to see in which ways do those reforms help, like actually getting at, is it being able to open a bank account that makes women want to be entrepreneurs? Maybe, yeah? Or is it, maybe we don't really care about them working in industrial jobs and we can focus on other policies. Then we also have, just other outcomes to look at, and particularly the income literature saying that, is it the case that when women are able to participate in the economy, we know that labor force participation rates increase, we should expect incomes to also increase. And then the last thing I want to talk about is these decreases in economic freedom for women. So a lot of our papers stop in 2015 because we want to have enough post-treatment time to look at. But in this 2015 to 2017 period, there were about 40 countries that had decreases in their economic freedom for women. Their GDI scores fell, and some of them quite substantially. Really kind of massive worldwide rollback in economic freedom for women, which is a bummer. And so trying to understand what the impact of that was. Like, we know that expanding economic freedom for women brought good things. Is taking it away going to bring bad things? And I think that that's kind of the next set of papers is going to be looking at that 2015, 2017 range and the impacts of those laws. Particularly, the majority of those laws are looking at allowing women to work at night, work in dangerous jobs, work in industrial jobs. A lot of health and safety type arguments were made. But again, it's very 1908 Oregon to me. I'm like, if I want to work in an industrial job, what's it to you? So that's kind of something that I think we'll be talking about a lot more in this area. So that's all I have. I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions because I know this ends at 10:50, but I just want to thank you all for your time and listening to me, and I hope you all see that economic freedom for women can benefit everyone. Yeah, thank you.
I'll start with the first question since I have a microphone, and then if you could repeat the other people's questions because they won't hear them on Zoom. So the one question I have is, first of all, great job. It was very interesting, learned a lot. But a question I have is, you talked about how there was a study that looked at how economic freedom affected gender norms.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering, and I know that the Economic Freedom Index existed before the GDI, and without the GDI, I'm wondering, has there been any work to look at if economic freedom without GDI actually influences the GDI score as well?
Yeah, when they made the GDI scores, they were really worried about that relationship, right? And so there's been a lot of stuff done with the predictive, of a previous economic freedom scores predicting your GDI scores when Rosie did them in 2015. She did a dissertation on this. So I'm not going to necessarily be able to encapsulate all of the work that she did in that dissertation, but yes, she did do all of that. That was 3 chapters of her basically making sure that the GDI was good. But yes, I think that they didn't find that it's not going to they're associated, obviously they're correlated, but it's not necessarily the case that it was a perfect predictor for your gender disparity. Namely because the reason for this whole thing was that she was seeing countries like Kuwait and the UAE that score really high in economic freedom, but have zero economic freedom for women, right? And she's like this, and so when you incorporate that, they drop huge. And it's, you know, she's like, I just don't think that it's an accurate reflection to say that the UAE is a top 5 place to do business. It's top 5 place to do business if you're a man, right? And she's like, that's not necessarily an accurate thing. So I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yes.
So on your slide that showed the countries that had 1 point decrease for the GDI, I was not surprised that many of them seem to be third world type countries.
Yeah.
I was surprised to see Switzerland on that list.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because there are some places, so it's similar to the US stuff. Theirs just was a little bit later. It was like the bank account stuff and some stuff with inheritance. They were a little behind us on, and the rest of Europe. But Switzerland was bizarre to me as well. They went from 0.8 to 1, right? It wasn't like they went from 0 to 0.23. So that's like one of the things that a lot of people critique with these jump literatures, is that a jump from 4 to 5 might not be the same as a jump from 7 to 8. But we don't really have any ways to get around that right now. I'm open to suggestions. But so that's kind of the making control for like their baseline level or whatever but yeah, that's what you got. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure, Jim.
So I'm curious if there's been much thought in the literature, if you've thought much about the issue of 1, demographic crisis, and 2, the relationship between population growth and innovation. So we all want, I think, we have egalitarian norms and beliefs.
Yeah, sure.
And we see that one of the effects of deferring childbearing, both for men and women, but I imagine maybe the effects more obvious as women are waiting until they get a better age. Is that we'll have slower or even topping out or reversal of population growth.
Yeah.
Is there much thought about long-term impacts of economic prosperity because of that?
Right. So Jim's asking about population growth and like the concerns about like population like decline, right? Like there's plenty of developed countries there. They're worried about not replacing, you know what I mean, the people that they have. You know, women are having children, far fewer children, far later. You can think of like your Japan case, for example, right? This is a problem. I think that for the fertility stuff, I was almost expecting like a U-shaped relationship, right? Where it would affect the really unfree places and then the really free places and then kind of be in the middle. But I found that this negative effect. Some people have argued same thing with income, right? That J-shaped relationship between of income and fertility. And so I think like in the paper, I argue that in the same way that the income literature doesn't argue that the way in order to like get women to have more children is to make sure that they're earning less money. It's the same thing that I would say about economic freedom, right? That economic freedom is on the whole a good thing. And in like the kind of lower economic freedom countries, we should be thinking about that as a way to reduce fertility rates, because there are a lot of other countries that have issues with trying to lower their fertility rates. Like they're trying to have women make women have fewer children, right? And so that's like a policy recommendation. But on the flip side, you could say that increasing economic freedom in these kind of developed countries, there are other policies that can go alongside it that would make having a child more attractive, right? So there's this recent paper, it's an NBER working paper, which I will send to you. It's talking about changes in fertility literature, kind of what we've been finding with this income stuff in highly developed countries, particularly thinking about how remote work, changing norms about fathers participating in child rearing, and other kinds of like making it easier to have a kid in rich countries, basically, will entice women to have more children. And so flexible work, this is Claudia Golden's argument, right? Flexible work will make it easier for us to have kids. And so they're seeing this particularly in Europe and the US and Canada, that the fertility, there are actually increases in fertility in the higher income distributions because they have more flexibility. Does that answer your question? Yes, no? There's a trade-off.
That's good, yeah. And then the problem then, or is anybody thinking about innovation or, economic development in general because of that. So we think of population growth as
Yeah.
the engine, part of the engine of knowledge development, right? We live in a world of innovation that improves capital productivity. And so if we actually want to maintain capital growth, we actually want to have more people.
Yeah.
So maybe nobody's thinking about that.
I don't know if anybody is, but you are, so that's great. And I think that, and so, I mean, Jim, you do economic freedom stuff, and all this kind of stuff anytime, nothing's stopping you. But no, I mean, it's a good thought. I think that most people are focused on the population stuff right now more than the innovation side of things. I had Liz first, and then I'll go to you, Dragon. Unless there's a student, and I would love to give preference to students. Oh, yeah, sorry. Hope you understand.
So for like changing economic freedom to happen mostly internally or like kind of externally to like other countries like helping them out?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's some really interesting stuff now on like spatial spillover. So you're asking about like whether or not countries are helping other countries become more economically free. You might have noticed, especially in that list of countries, a lot of South American countries that had increases in their economic freedom, and it was kind of in the 80s and 90s. A lot of this is like the US's involvement in, replacing dictators with other dictators, basically. But and then of course you see increases in economic freedom scores. So there is a little bit of that. There is a little bit of like, oh, my neighbor's doing well, they changed this policy, maybe we should do this. This is well established in economics that states and countries compete on policies, and they kind of look around at what's going on around them. But it isn't until, I don't know, whenever Don Lacombe started writing these papers, looking at these spatial spillovers, 10 years, but yeah. It's a great question. It isn't entirely internal, but you also will see these kind of like islands of blue in the sea of red. So sometimes if you just have good policies, you got good policies and you don't care about your neighbors. Yeah. All right, Dragon. Oh, no, sorry, Liz, then Dragon. Gotta be fair.
This is actually somewhat related. You may not know the answer. So over in political science, we have good evidence that the way that you get more rights for women, well, there's lots of ways, but one of the best ways is to have women participating in politics, either as voters or as legislators. But we also have good evidence that the way you trigger female participation is by allowing women in the workforce outside the home, so that they have the opportunity to interact with each other and organize against the state, essentially.
Yeah.
But that's do you have any insight into when you can actually, because you're in a catch-22 then.
Yeah, it is. It's like, okay, so Liz's question is that like, the way to get good policies for women is to have women in government, but the way to get women in government is to have them working. But if to have them working is to have good policies, this is a weird problem that we have. Summarize. So yeah, I don't know. But you just blew my mind. I'm gonna think about that all weekend, but I don't know. We should talk about that. I don't know. I think that,
I was hoping you would just have an answer. And then
yeah, me too. I don't know. Yeah, I'm gonna think on that more, but okay. Yeah, Dragon?
Sure. So to ensure simple reproduction, a woman needs to have about 2.2, 2.3 children.
Yeah.
That's kind of globally, depends obviously on the country and
Yep.
sort of quality of infant health care and infant mortality. So that's 2.2, 2.3.
Right.
So we have been in that realm in many developed nations, but especially Europe or so, for many decades now. So whose responsibility is in terms of global development and ensure that developed nations continue to develop? Is, for instance, the current immigration crisis, first in Europe, then here, because what's happening here started happening in Europe in 2015.
Yeah.
So who's responsible for that? If a picture of economic development, equality or so is something that we want, and I think that's what we do want, how do we address that? So different from Jim's question, but I think they're avoiding to answer some difficult questions.
Yeah.
We are very self-centered in trying to answer. So
That's fair. So yeah, I mean, so Dragon's question's asking about like whose responsibility is it for these policies in order to raise or lower fertility rates, right? Or maintain fertility rates. Is that your question?
and ensure as well economic development
Yeah, because if there's a trade-off between fertility and development. Yeah. No, it's a question. I don't know if there's necessarily a should answer there. Like, I don't know what's the, like, some people may think that economic development is worth it, and other people may think that it's not. I mean, it kind of depends on who's in charge, I suppose.
I guess I argue that we are social beings as human, but we are also like biological beings.
Yes.
That aspect has been neglected and undervalued, and I think coming from a family where mother and aunt and everybody's PhD and wife and sister and so pretty educated family, like I appreciate women, but who is responsible for the way of life that we promote?
Yeah, I think, okay, so, I mean, I think what I would push back on that is that it's not like a pure, I don't think it's a pure trade-off between economic development and fertility, like you're making it sound. I think that there are things that can go alongside of economic freedom policies that make it easier for women to have children and participate in the economy. Like, we can have both. That whole like classic feminine, you can do it both, girl, but like we could be better on both fronts in terms of expanding economic freedom for women and also making it so that it's not so prohibitively costly to have a child, that you are able to work and be able to have a child, and it's not this huge decision that we have to make. I think that there are plenty of policies that can make room for that. Yeah, well, yeah, obviously. You appreciate women and grandkids. Hi, Kaylee, yeah.
So maybe I should just look into this myself, but I was just wondering if there's any other, so women have been empowered to have kids later, but the downside of that is that fertility goes down.
Yeah.
Is there any like having substitute IVF or then
Yeah, that's such a good question. There's a lot of people the referees that refereed that paper wanted me to talk about IVF too, right? So obviously in higher income countries, it's easier to to do IVF, but no one's actually talked about it. That's kind of the, I sound like a broken record in this, but it's like, no one's written that paper. You should write that paper, because for better or worse, we've only been talking about the entire country or the entire population and not just women-specific issues in this literature. So yes, I do think that Clara and forget the Stone and Piano paper, they talk about the fertility gap. They argue that IVF also allows for that, right? So if you're more economically free, you probably have more money, you might be waiting longer, but you also have the means to have children in the time frame that works best for you, right? So and that would be better than just saying like you're having more or less kids, right? That your expectations are being met. I think that's interesting. But yeah, you should work on that. I know you have other plans, but anyways, I don't know if I repeated that, but the question was about IVF. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, hi.
So, in one of your slides, you mentioned the GDI improving that the infant mortality rate decreased. Would you say that was mostly in part due to the size of abortions being kind of mitigated by the economic freedom side of things, like policies? Or what do you think was the cause of that?
Well, so infant mortality doesn't include abortions. It just has like, it's the number of infant deaths per 1,000 births. So it's just basically getting at that like health outcomes have improved for mothers, right? Because that's like going to be a determining factor of infant death, and also just like, so like in utero health has improved. It's kind of what we're getting at. It's also that fewer mothers are dying during childbirth. So there's just like a greater emphasis placed on like mother and child life, I think, and also health, like quality of healthcare, kind of is what that result is suggesting.
So is it kind of like with an improvement of economic freedom, just overall technology?
Yes, yeah, improvements in medical care, quality of healthcare. We find that in the literature anyway, that like healthcare improves when we are more economically free, partially through that the mechanism or the way that we get that is through increased incomes, right? But it's also like increased education and things like that too also certainly affect like the health and well-being of mother and child. Yeah, good question. Any other students? Oh, yeah.
I'm curious
curious how equality of opportunity and equality of outcome are being weighed and balanced in all of this. I'm studying engineering and economics. I'm interested in, I will be my own CEO of my own company someday.
Oh yeah, you will.
And I'm gonna eventually, when I hire people, I care about people who are the most talented, have the best product of labor. I don't care if my company is skewed predominantly women or predominantly men.
Sure.
And I'm just curious how all this is being weighed and designed, because it would be arbitrary for me to hire 50% men and 50% women.
Totally.
Equality. So I'm curious how all the research and literature is balancing, measuring for equality of opportunity and equality of outcome.
Yeah, so it's definitely right now just looking at equality of like opportunity and then just like levels, right, as like the outcome. So we're not necessarily saying that increasing economic freedom for women means that all of a sudden everything's gonna be 50-50, super fair, kumbaya. It just means that like we've increased opportunities for women to have better outcomes in terms of their education, participating in markets, et cetera. And I think that like everyone would agree that's a good thing. Now there are plenty of, I think any proponent of economic freedom for women would also argue that we're not trying to like mandate like equal, like 50-50 in terms of hiring either. That's not necessarily the argument there. So right now we're just looking at like increases in levels because of the increase in equality, but not necessarily the increase in equality after the increase in equality, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, so my question is that, because I'm very big on freedom.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering how you're able to measure it, because if you make a place free, it's like you have free policies, and if you're gonna measure something, how do you measure the pure freedom as opposed to then the outcome, to see that people have the equality of opportunity versus then the raw outcome, how are you able to measure that and factor both?
Right, so we have like the measures of freedom from like the Economic Freedom Index and the GDI that are going to be able to let us know like how free a place is and how the freedom increases. And then we'll look at like a ton of other data sources that are going to give us kind of just like a bird's eye view. Now we're trying to get better about using like individual level data, but a lot of this stuff right now is like aggregated to the national level or some sort of state or province or whatever. So it's not going to be necessarily like we get to follow an individual over time. That would be cool, but we don't have that good of data. So I think a lot of it will be just kind of looking at like changes in overall averages. It's not any more fancy than that, but I can control for income level, education level, and all that kind of stuff, and finding that it's helping all women. Yeah. Yeah, just general stuff. Because again, it's new, so we're just starting with the low-hanging fruit, and then we'll get fancy after that. Yeah.
I guess with regard to those characteristics, it's not like general, this policy exists in this country, those distribution.
Right now, it's just the increase in the GDR score, but then we're going to try to say, well, what happened when Switzerland allowed women to have bank accounts? We'll look at a Switzerland-specific case. Like that's kind of the next wave of papers, right? Yeah.
How do you change like the gender norms and then improve like the GDI?
Yeah, so it seems like it's happening through like both ways, kind of like what Liz was saying, was that like you could change gender norms and then people might want to say we should change these policies. But Rosie's also finding that when we change the policies and women are just able to participate in the market and say you go to an accountant and it's a woman, and then you're like, wow, women can do business. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's just little things like that where it's just like representation and the opportunities to participate might just shape norms as time goes on. So it's kind of hard to know what's driving what. But we know that norms are really persistent, and so I thought that paper that Rosie had was kind of cool, because a lot of people will push back and say, yeah, you can change the law, but that doesn't mean that everyone's going to start opening up bank accounts overnight, right? Like, but it seems to be that, at least in some cases, people actually are responding to the policy, and then it's filtering through, and that it's being reflected in changing opinions. But it also could be that changing opinions are influencing policies. I really don't know, man. Yeah. Okay, one more.
With the GDI, did you say there was a
17, yeah.
Would you say that that's a complete comprehensive list of questions, or is there a question like you add?
Oh gosh, yeah, there's so many questions that I would love to add to it. Being able to, like some of the stuff that was in the like being able to file patents and things like that, that's not in the GDI right now. A lot of it is we're at the mercy of what's available at the international level for 160 plus countries. So the World Bank is really egalitarian in the sense that if they can't get data from Micronesia, then we're not doing it for anybody, kind of a deal. So like, unfortunately, we end up getting incomplete indices, right? Where we might have data from a lot of countries, but not all the countries, so then they just completely drop it. Yeah, that's one of the ones, like patents and, I mean, not getting fired for being pregnant, and also like restrictions on the number of hours that you work, things like that. We don't have information on that because sometimes it's even like subnational, like the hour restrictions and stuff, so it's tough to say. But there's a lot of things that aren't being, this is a very incomplete picture. But what I would argue then is that if it's an incomplete picture, if we're seeing an increase and it's bringing good things, like imagine what it would be if we could capture it all. So I'm just gonna say it's like downward biasing results, which is my favorite get out of jail free card, is that it's just gonna downward bias my results. But yeah, I think that's what I would say. I think that's my time, but there's food after this, and unless Sean has something to say.
So I was just going to say, again, great presentation, great
Thanks.
discussion. If you're, again, please, I encourage everyone April 5th to come to the next presentation. And so one more round of applause for Keri.